Mad Madame Lalaurie, the mistress of the haunted house. She has inspired legends for almost 200 years in New Orleans. But what of the story is true? What can we know from our records and contemporary sources? Well, you may be surprised to learn that most of the story is verifiable, down to her burial in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. But what is more surprising to me is that this is the only story of this kind that has lasted. The documented cruelty by Delphine Lalaurie was not unique. The unique aspect is that we still tell her story. White Creole women in antebellum New Orleans were known for being cruel and torturous, especially to those they enslaved. The truths about Madame Lalaurie do not require any embellishments to turn your stomach. It is a questionable fact of the human species that we are drawn to the goriest and most grotesque stories. This bloodlust is revealed in the fact that white Creole women were known for being particularly cruel to their enslaved people. The theories on why this is true has been and will be debated. We will discuss the legends, and I will share the truth. Knowing what is documented tends to turn my stomach more than the hyperbole we can roll our eyes at. You have been warned. Another quirk of Louisiana that makes this retelling of the documentation possible is our reliance on civil law instead of English common law. This arose from the importance of the port. When the Louisiana Territory became American, there were already so many contracts and legal filings and lawyers to untangle that they basically decided not to untangle it. This one will be different, they said, and they left us to continue recording and notarizing all transactions as required by the less common civil law, sometimes referred to as Napoleonic law. Another oddity is the prevalence or requirement of Catholicism in Louisiana before freedom of religion reigned in the American takeover. The Catholic Church records all sacraments, and all citizens of the colony had to be Catholic by law. Through these records, we can piece together life stories, when they were born through baptismal records, when they married, what property they bought and sold, their involvement within trading enslaved people, and anything else that may have been notarized. So while the legends of Delphine are many, we can piece together some truths about her life and why she has become so infamous in history. Let's start with the legends. Madame Lalaurie, who lived at 1140 Royal Street, was a premier socialite in New Orleans from an old Creole family. Her husband, Dr. Lalaurie, was a doctor. There were rumors of unusual cruelty toward her enslaved people, but investigations yielded only glowing reports of Delphine's charming nature. During a party one night, her home caught fire, and when the fire brigade arrived to assist, she requested rudely that instead of rescuing her enslaved people, they rescue her antique furniture. They refused her requests and discovered the mutilated and tortured people that Delphine had enslaved. 7 people were rescued that night, and they were brought to the Cabildo for treatment and food. Meanwhile, an angry crowd gathered around the fire-consumed home and dismantled what didn't burn. Madame Delphine escaped via coach to Lake Pontchartrain, where she met a schooner and alighted to the North Shore, and eventually on to Mobile, where she fled for Paris and spent her remaining days in exile. Her escape from justice hangs heavy over the property. After she fled, many bones were discovered in the courtyard and well at the Royal Street property. One was of a young enslaved girl named Leah, who is said to have hit a snag in Delphine's hair while she was brushing it. Delphine became so enraged, and Leah was so scared, that she chased her to the gallery, and the girl jumped to her death to avoid the punishment at the hands of Delphine. The girl's bones are said to be among those found. The bricked-up window is said to be where she jumped from. Since Delphine was run out of New Orleans, this home has served as a conservatory of music and a school and a furniture store, as well as the private residence of Nicolas Cage for a while. But no one is said to be able to remain here for long, as the ghosts of the tortured enslaved people who lived here have not been able to cross from this realm, or let anyone who stays there long rest as they were prevented from doing. Delphine never returned to New Orleans in life, but she was interred in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, and a decaying plaque noting her burial was discovered in the 1940s on a tomb. Let me know in the comments if I missed a detail you know. How much of this can we account for? Surprisingly, a lot of it was documented in the contemporary times. I won't be diving into any of the accounts that attempt to defend Delphine. We have far too much evidence to consider it likely that this was some kind of smear campaign against her family. In addition, as I've mentioned, this type of cruelty was not necessarily unique to Delphine. She had at least one relative who was also credibly accused of killing her enslaved people. The torture and fire at 1140 Rue Royale happened. There is little doubt. So let's dive into the story of Madame Lalaurie and the haunted house on Rue Royale. We'll go point by point to show what we know to be true and what we think is likely based on the documented sources. To do this, I used Carolyn Morrow Long's 2012 book, Madame Lalaurie, as my source. She has gone through all of the known documentation to find the details we know to be true, and this is the definitive book on the topic, as of today. Starting with the villain, Madame Lalaurie. She was in fact a socialite who was from an old Creole family well known in New Orleans. She was born Delphine McCarty in 1787 in the midst of rebellions of enslaved people in Louisiana and Saint-Domingue. Her family had a plantation just south of the city. It was where the Press Street train tracks lie currently. This location is infamous as where Homer Plessy was arrested for sitting in a white car of the train, leading to the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which codified Jim Crow segregation until Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 overturned it. Her plantation was where these tracks are, and this area was known as Faubourg Delphine when she began selling it off, until the railroad company purchased some of it and it became a train yard. Where the plantation house stood, there is a World War I Victory Arch in a green space known as McCarty Square. Delphine married thrice. She was first married to Ramon Lopez y Angulo de la Candelaria when she was 13 in 1800. He was 35 and a widower. 4 years later, the Republic of Haiti was established after the successful revolt of enslaved people on Saint-Domingue that had lasted much of Delphine's life. Her first husband, Lopez, died in Cuba the same year after a ship ran aground while they were on their way to Madrid. Days later, she gave birth to her first child, Borgia, who was named after her dead husband's first wife. Lopez was known as being the Spanish official who reopened the African slave trade in Louisiana, even with the fear of rebellion that loomed over the colony. Delphine returned to New Orleans with her child. She wed her second husband, Jean Blanc, in 1807, shortly after her mother died. Her mother was not murdered by those she enslaved. However, her uncle, Baptiste César Le Breton, was murdered by those he enslaved in 1771, more than a decade before Delphine was born. Jean Blanc was a well-respected figure in New Orleans. He was the go-between for Jean Lafitte and Governor Claiborne during the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. Jean was known as a shrewd businessman, and he was involved in the politics of the city. He was a director of the Bank of Louisiana and bought the property next door, which is now 409 Royal Street. The couple split their time between this property and their plantation, known as Villa Blanc, near the property she grew up on below the city. They had 4 children, Pauline, Laure, Jean, and Pauline. In a letter from Claiborne, the territorial governor, to Thomas Jefferson, he wrote, "Mr. Jean Blanc resides near New Orleans and is a merchant in high credit. About 3 years ago, he married a very beautiful Creole lady possessing a large estate and connected with one of the most numerous and respectable families in the county of Orleans. Mr. Blanc is a man of genius and education and possesses considerable influence in the city. He is a member of the City Council, a director of the Louisiana Bank, and has been for the last 3 years a member of the House of Representatives for the territory. Mr. Blanc is much disliked by most of the Native Americans residing in and near New Orleans. His attachments are supposed to be wholly foreign, and they consider him a dangerous man." Slightly ironic that Jean Blanc and the Lafitte brothers sided with the Americans during the battle. Without their assistance, it's likely that New Orleans would have been taken by the British, even though this battle occurred after the war was over. Shortly after the Battle of New Orleans, Jean Blanc died in 1815. He was 50 years old, and Delphine was now 28 and a widow again. Enslaving people was common among the upper-class society of New Orleans at this time, and it was expected by people like Delphine. They literally could not maintain their lifestyles without unpaid labor making it happen on a daily basis. Delphine owned at least 54 people throughout her life that we can account for, but it was her union with Jean Blanc that saw her trafficking in people increase. It seems that one of his primary sources of income was in the slave trades, and he died with a considerable debt. Delphine worked to settle his estate. While she did emancipate at least one person during this time at Jean's request in his will, 8 others died under her watch during this time after Blanc died and before she met her third and final husband. Their deaths were recorded without cause at St. Louis Cathedral. They were primarily women and children. In 1824, Delphine's money troubles from Jean Blanc were alleviated by the death of her father. He left her and her brother a considerable estate. He also included his child with a free woman of color in his will, who received $5,000 and 2 slaves. 1824 is also the year Dr. Louis Lalaurie arrived in New Orleans from France. He had just finished his training as a physician at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1823, but he was not from a prominent family. His expertise was in treating orthopedic conditions such as hunchbacks. He was told by his father to find a wealthy woman to marry in New Orleans to help raise the prominence of his family. This brings us to 1825, the year Delphine and Dr. Louis Lalaurie meet. She was a wealthy woman, both by inheritance and at this time by her own business acumen. She was a grandmother and 38 years old. Louis was 22. Their son, Jean-Louis, was born in 1827, and the couple finally wed after the doctor returned from a visit to France in 1828. In 1831, they acquired a partially built townhouse at the corner of Hospital and Royal Streets in the city for their residence. We will leave the Lalauries in 1831 with their unfinished townhouse for now. Make sure to like so we can make sure the true story of the haunted house prospers over the legends. Subscribe to catch part 2 and the rest of the story of Delphine Lalaurie coming soon.